So we've been studying the harmony of the Gospels, and last week we talked about Zacchaeus, and hopefully that song stuck in your head all week. And we talked about his salvation. We also talked about, in Luke, the parable to teach responsibility while the kingdom is delayed. And we started in John chapter 11 into John chapter 12, and this marks another significant milestone in Jesus' ministry where he's actually heading to Jerusalem for the last time in his triumphal entry. We'll just kind of key it up. If you would turn to John chapter 11, verse 55, this is where we left off after reading this last week. Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and many went up to Jerusalem out of the country before the Passover to purify themselves. Therefore they were seeking for Jesus, and they were wondering to one another as they stood in the temple, "What do you think? Will he not come to the feast at all?" Now the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was, they should report it that they might seize him. Jesus therefore 6 days before the Passover came to Bethany where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. And that's where we left off. We did jump ahead last week a few verses and talked a little bit about Lazarus. So what's significant about Lazarus? He died, right? Jesus raised him from the dead. And there was a crowd from Jerusalem there when he performed that, correct? And one of the significant things, he didn't die and like 15 minutes later, Jesus raised him from the dead. He'd been dead for what? 4 days. So there's no doubt that this guy is what? Dead. He's raised from the dead, and because of that, people were, number one, what? Talking. Number two, some people put their faith in who? Jesus, right? And this was reported to who? The Pharisees, right? That didn't sit well with them. So Lazarus is a walking miracle and a walking testament, right? And what's the Jews' plans for him now? They want to kill him, right? If you can't kill, they had been able to kill Jesus, so they're going to try to kill the miracle. So, we're going to read about that here in a minute. So we'll continue on, and I'm going to kind of bounce back and forth a little bit, but we're going to stay mostly in John. So John 12, verse 2. So he's in Bethany. Matthew and Mark both say that he's at the home of Simon the leper, so this is where this is taking place. Verse 2, so they made him a supper there, and Martha was serving, but Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with him. Mary therefore took a pound of very costly perfume and nard. So when Jesus went to go back to Bethany after he heard that Lazarus was dead, who did he encounter? The two sisters, right? And now you have Lazarus is here and the two sisters, but they're at Simon the leper's house. And we see in verse 3, Mary therefore took a pound of very costly perfume of pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, who was intending to betray him, said, Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" Now he said this not because he was concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief, and he had the money box he used to pilfer what was put into it. Jesus said, "Therefore, let her alone, in order that she might keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you will not always have me." So can you just picture this scene in this house? They're reclining at the table. Mary comes in. It's a very costly perfume. She breaks it open, and I assume the aroma filled that room as she's doing this. The other Gospels say that, some were indignant, remarking to one another, why has this perfume been wasted? And John makes it a point to write about one specific individual, and who was that? Judas. And we see a little bit of Judas's character and motivation here, don't we? Was he really concerned about the poor? What was he concerned about? That's less money in the treasury, right, that he had control of, that he used to pilfer from. And I'm going to jump to Mark chapter 14, just verses 8 and 9, because this isn't in John's gospel. And this is right after he said, "You have the poor with you always, but you won't always have me." Verse 8, "She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for the burial. And I truly say to you, wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world, that also which this woman has done shall be spoken of in memory of her." So this morning we're fulfilling what Jesus said, right? We're talking about that woman, and he said, wherever the gospel's preached, this is going to be talked about in her memory. So, question I have for you guys this morning, one of the first questions, what else are we doing in our lives to fulfill what Jesus spoke? He spoke a lot of things, didn't he? Seek, you shall find. Go into all the world. He gave us a lot of things. How are we measuring up to fulfilling that? The other things that Jesus spoke. All right. We're going to jump back to John chapter 12, starting in verse 9. "The great multitude, therefore, the Jews learned that he was there, and they came, not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might also see Lazarus, whom he raised from the dead. But the chief priests took counsel that they might put Lazarus to death also, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and were believing in Jesus." So again, the Jews have another problem, right? And Terry caught me after class last week, and we had a conversation about this. What are they wanting to do to Lazarus? How does that fulfill the law of God in the Ten Commandments? Thou shalt not kill. But they could justify it, right? Did Saul justify killing? They did. So what's their logic in their justification for that?
Well, first of all, they pin blasphemy on Jesus, and that's what they'll kill.
Let me grab one of these. This is number 2.
They're going to kill Jesus for blasphemy. That'll be the thing that they hang their justification on. It's just murder. At its base, it's murder, because they're not looking back at the things the Lord commanded Moses. And that would never enter your mind if you're a devout Jew following after the things that Moses had said. Killing is not, unless he's done something, and so they'll pick up blasphemy and they'll use that as the
Healing on the Sabbath.
right. And then for Lazarus himself, then you look at it and where, what are they going to pin this on? Are they going to pin this on some kind of a motivation of demons or something? They'll do anything to pin something on Jesus, and they'll make Lazarus the point of that. Not only that, but they've enraged the Sadducees. So the Sadducees say there's no life. And here you have life after death. And so it's just, they've painted the Pharisees into a corner, and they're exposed for who they are.
Yeah.
And that's the reality. There's one more thing about this anointing that's happened, is that if you think about what she did in lavishing that gift on our Lord, she used the most glorified thing that a woman has is her hair. And that the dirtiest thing in the societies back there, it still is today in some of the Middle Eastern societies, is your feet. And she used her hair, the most glorified thing that a woman has, to clean the master's feet.
Yeah.
You think about that for a little bit, it'll set you back in the love and devotion she had for her master. And I think we have to ask ourselves how devoted we are, seriously.
Yeah. Thanks, Terry. So has Lazarus done anything deserving of murder to be killed? Yeah. Lazarus wasn't involved in the decision to be raised from the dead, was he? But yet, on the account of him, Jesus is getting more popular, right? And that's a threat. The risk tolerance for Jesus is zero now, right, from the rulers. Anything he does, they're scrutinizing, they're looking for a way to trap him, to trick him, to condemn him. So, I've always wondered, we know Lazarus died again, right? But I wonder if he lived in fear of his life, or if he just had a normal life after Jesus was gone. But don't know, but just some of those thoughts that pop into my mind. So on account of this miracle being performed in a very close vicinity of Jerusalem, the Jews from Jerusalem saw it, and it spread very rapidly. They've got to figure out a way to kill the miracle. So. Yes.
When you think about what different people are thinking during some of this conversation and stuff, when Jesus says, "For the poor you'll have with you, you always have with you, but you don't always have me," it makes me think about what Mary and Martha might have been thinking, because a little while ago Jesus wasn't there and their brother died. And then Jesus was there, and their brother's alive again. But he's talking about, I'm not always going to be here. And what a frightening feeling that must have been.
Now, this physical body's fixing to be not going to be around anymore. So, yeah, would be interesting. I always wondered how Mary felt when Judas is making his objection to the whole thing also. And then Jesus resets the perspective, right? So she's anointed me before I'm even going to die for my burial. And what she's done, people are going to still be talking about wherever the gospel's preached. Sadly, so is a statement about Judas, right? All right. We're the next, if you would turn to Mark chapter 11, the very beginning of that chapter in that gospel. We'll read about his triumphal entry. Mark 11, verse 1. And as they approached Jerusalem at Bethphage and Bethany near the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the village opposite you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there on which no one has ever sat. Untie it and bring it here. And if anyone says to you, 'Why are you doing this?' you say, 'The Lord has need of it,' and immediately he will send it back here." And they went away, found a colt tied at the door outside in the street, and they untied it. And some of the bystanders were saying to them, "What are you doing untying the colt?" And they spoke to them just as Jesus had told them, and they gave them permission. And they brought the colt to Jesus, and they put their garments on it, and he sat upon it. So I've always wondered, this here, Jesus says, go find that colt. And if they ask you what you're doing, just tell them the Lord needs it. Do you think the owners were happy to let Jesus borrow that animal for a little bit? I think so. I think so. Verse 8, and many spread their garments in the road, and others spread leafy branches which they had cut from the fields. And those who were before and those who followed after were crying out, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest." So, is this a small spectacle? It's not. We're going to jump to Luke here in a minute to finish the rest of this story. Jesus enters on a colt. And what are people thinking is about to happen? Because last week we studied, he had to give them a parable about you need to wait, right? Because they thought the kingdom of God was going to what? Appear immediately here on earth, that things like that were going to happen. He's entering Jerusalem around the Passover, and what are people proclaiming him to be? King. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. So, they're laying out the red carpet, right? Where's this crowd when he's in front of Pilate? Are they intimidated by the rulers? Makes you just ponder how it flips from this triumphal entry to what happens days later.
That happens at his arrest. So he's arrested and nothing happens. The kingdom doesn't come with power. The angels don't come down from heaven and sweep away the Romans. Things don't happen the way they're thinking they want it to happen. And then all of a sudden, the bubble is burst. And so they're going to end up on the other side in the other crowd. And that's sad. Very sad, because they still don't understand who Jesus is. Neither did the apostles. They didn't understand.
There was an understanding in Acts chapter 2, wasn't there? After Peter preached. And it makes me wonder if some of the people in that crowd were in this crowd earlier. Because as we talk about the physical versus the spiritual is the struggle Jesus had when he tried to lay his message out to everybody. They're thinking physical, and he's like, I'm talking about things spiritual. Isn't that the conversation he had with Nicodemus? It's like, you can't understand the physical, how can you understand the spiritual, right? And you're supposed to be one of the leaders. So, you can turn if you want to, but we're going to be back in Luke chapter 19, verse 39. This is a little bit more detail after Jesus comes in, the triumphal entry. Luke 19, verse 39, and some of the Pharisees and the multitude said to him, Teacher, rebuke your disciples. And he answered, said, If I tell these become silent, the stones will cry out. Then he approached and saw the city and wept over it, saying, If you had known this day, even you, the things which make for peace, but now they have been hidden from your eyes. For the day shall come upon you when your enemies will throw up a bank before you and surround you and hem you in on every side, and you will level you to the ground and your children within you, and they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation. So the Pharisees are upset about this triumphal entry where they're praising Jesus and basically saying this dude's going to be the king. And they're telling them to what? Rebuke your what? Disciples, your followers. And he tells them, if I make them be quiet, what's going to happen? Nature's going to cry out, right? The stones are going to cry out. And they should have understood that reference. And it says, and when he approached, he saw the city and what? Wept. How has God always viewed the Israelites if we look at the Old Testament? His children, his chosen people, supposed to be a nation of priests. God adored the Israelites, loved them, cared for them, redeemed them once, twice, over and over if you look through Judges and you read Ezra and Nehemiah. And when Jesus, he's encountered a lot of headaches and roadblocks in his ministry, right? Trying to get his point across to people, trying to get people to understand. And when he shows up to Jerusalem, what's his emotional state when he finally looks at the city? There's some godly sorrow there, right? Have we ever caused that godly sorrow? That's the question to ask. That's the question you need to reflect on. Have we caused godly sorrow to where Jesus wept? And he's weeping over them because he's like, if you'd only known what day this is, talking about this time. But it's been what? Hidden from you. And then he goes on to talk about the siege that's going to happen to Jerusalem later. And it's going to be a very ugly scene. So, anyway, that's the thought that hit me as I was studying through that this week is, have I ever caused this kind of godly sorrow? All right. Any comments before we move on? Okay. If you would, let's turn to Matthew chapter 21, and we'll be in the very, very beginning of that chapter. We'll be in verse 10, so sorry about that. Verse 10, and when he had entered Jerusalem, all the city was stirred, saying, "Who is this?" So you have this triumphal entry. It's a pretty big spectacle, and people are saying, "Who is this?" And the multitudes were saying, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee." And the blind and lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. And when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things he had done, and the children who were crying out in the temple and saying, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they became indignant. So indignant, is that a weak adjective or? Here he goes again, right? Helping people. We don't like it. Because why? He's adding more people to his team, right? Isn't that how they're kind of viewing it? He's not our political affiliation, right? He's not in our circle of influence. So they became indignant and said to him, "Do you hear what these are saying?" And Jesus said to them, Have you never read, out of the mouth of infants and nursing babes, thou hast prepared praise for thyself? And he left them and went out of the city to Bethany and lodged there. So he quoted what to them? The law. Do you think they like being quoted the law from somebody who never studied under the rabbis there in Jerusalem? They were quick to condemn him by their law that had become just traditions of men, right? But he gets back to the law. We had a preacher one time, Harold Moore in Shallowater, that we loved to death, and he would have breakfast every month with the different, Shallowater's like 1,800 people, so he would have a breakfast once a month with all the other, like the Baptist preacher, the Methodist preacher, and I don't know what you call the Catholic guy, but with him. And he would always end his conversations with, "You've got to get back to the book. You got to get back in the book. This is where it comes from." And Jesus goes straight back to what? The book, the law. And he uses it to refute them, right? Isn't that what we're told to do? But we've got to know it, right? Continuing on, verse 18, now in the morning when he returned to the city, he became hungry. And seeing a lone fig tree by the road, he came to it and found nothing on it except leaves only. And he said to it, "No longer shall there ever be any fruit from you." So from what I understand in the studying I've done in the past is, if there's leaves on that tree, there should be a fig in the early part of the year, and this was kind of out of season. So this tree, Jesus was expecting this tree to what? Bear fruit, and it didn't. And what was his response to that tree? He cursed it. so nobody's ever going to eat from you again. And later on, we're going to read what happens to the tree. It withers away, and Peter says something, right? Hey, Jesus, that tree that you cursed, guess what? It's dead. So, another self-reflection this morning is what kind of tree are you? Are you bearing fruit? To where you look like you're bearing fruit from afar, but closer examination, are you bearing fruit? Are you really bearing fruit?
Just like the talents, what the tree had was taken away.
Toby said we studied about, the talents. The guy that just put his in a cloth or buried it, even what he had was taken away, so even what the tree had was taken away. So we all have a function in the kingdom. Are we doing that function? Are we doing that job? Are we producing that fruit? Are we using those talents to increase? And we find out if you're not doing that, the consequences aren't pleasant, are they? Verse 12, and Jesus entered the temple and cast out all those who were buying and selling in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And he said to them, it is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it into a robber's den. And there's an interesting, I want to pull out of Luke 19, verse 47 and 48. And right after he says this, overturns the tables, verse 47 in chapter 19, and he was teaching daily in the temple, but the chief priests and the scribes and the leading men among the people were trying to destroy him, and they could not find anything that they might do, for the people were hanging upon his words. Why were the money changers there and all of these animals? The Passover, you have to make what? Offerings, right? If you're coming from a distance, people would come and buy an animal for that. So there's a money-making opportunity right there, right? And people brought different. It wasn't like you had a euro back then, for that whole region. People had different, different money. And so these guys would exchange money. They would sell the animals and things like that. But they set it up as like commerce there in the temple. And was that the intent of the temple? I mean, if you want to get back to studying worship and everything, people can get far away from what the true intent was, right? It becomes tradition, then it's acceptable, and then he comes in there and wipes the slate clean, and he's like, this isn't right. And that's why I called it a den of robbers, because basically they were making money off of people that were coming there to try to sacrifice to God. Do you think the prices of animals spiked during the feast? Probably so. Then you find Jesus. The first time we can't locate Jesus when he's a boy. Where is he at? Where do we find him now? Temple. And he's teaching. Pharisees, everybody else, they don't like it. But he's not saying anything they can catch him on, hang him on. And then they're also fearful because what? The everyday people that they thumb their nose at, how does it describe how they're receiving Jesus' words? So they were hanging upon his words. And when we look at this, the Sermon on the Mount, does he give comforting words to this group of people? Blessed are who? The poor. He's given them a message that resonates with them. Do you think the Pharisees give them a message that resonates with them? Jesus is speaking the truth, and it's going right to their hearts, and they're hanging upon his words. So the question, another self-reflection question today, is do you let Jesus' words penetrate your heart to where you hang on them? Do we hang on them and meditate? Or do we hear it and go on? Do we let it really penetrate and change our behavior, our thought, our relationships, despite what the world says? Does it penetrate to where we produce fruit? Or does it just look like we produce fruit from afar? So, those are the thoughts I'm going to leave you with this morning. So I appreciate your attention and hope you have a wonderful week. So thank you.